The blistering sun beat down on the black asphalt, turning the air into a shimmering, suffocating blanket. Arthur Pendleton slammed his hand against the roof of his Bentley. The sharp thud was a small, unsatisfying release for the fury boiling inside him. A flat tire. A simple, common problem that had brought his world of nine-figure deals and absolute commands to a screeching halt on some forgotten backroad. The few cars that passed sped by without a second glance, their drivers cocooned in their own air-conditioned realities. It was like he was invisible. Or worse, just another roadside problem to be ignored. His jaw clenched. He'd built an empire on one simple idea, that everyone was out for themselves, and altruism was a fairy tale. And here, on this scorching ribbon of pavement, the world was proving him right. Each passing car was another piece of evidence, another brick in the fortress of cynicism he'd built around his heart. He was utterly alone, stranded by a world that didn't care. And in that moment, he hated it more than he ever had before. Arthur Pendleton didn't just live in a world of wealth. He had built it, brick by gold-plated brick. His mansion, a modernist slab of glass and cold stone, wasn't a home, it was a statement. It overlooked the city, but it was never a part of it. From his panoramic windows, the bustling metropolis below looked like a silent film, a colony of ants whose individual struggles didn't matter. His staff moved through the halls with the quiet efficiency of ghosts, their presence only acknowledged when he needed something. A chilled glass of water appearing on a coaster, a pressed suit laid out on the bed, a car waiting, engine humming, at the exact moment he needed to leave. These weren't interactions, they were functions, services rendered in the sterile bubble of his life. His days were a meticulously scheduled series of battles. In the boardroom, he was a predator, seeing negotiations not as collaborations, but as conquests. People were either assets to be leveraged or liabilities to be cut. He could dissect a balance sheet and a man's character with the same surgical precision, finding the weakness, the vanity, the hidden fear, and pressing down until the other side broke. Just that morning, he'd closed a hostile takeover. He had systematically dismantled the founding family's legacy, watching the CEO, a man 20 years his senior, just crumble. There was no joy in it, only the grim satisfaction of proving his hypothesis. Push hard enough, and everyone breaks. Everyone has a price. After the meeting, a storm of adrenaline and acid churning in his gut, he'd done something he never did. He dismissed his driver and took the long way home, chasing the illusion of freedom on the open road. He'd taken a turn onto a state highway he vaguely remembered from his youth, a road that snaked through rolling hills and farmland. It was a foolish impulse, and the universe had punished him for it. The jarring shudder and the pull of the wheel had been a rude awakening. Now, standing in the oppressive heat, his $1,000 suit jacket slung over the car door, he was no longer a titan of industry. He was just a man, sweating and powerless, a king dethroned by a piece of shredded rubber. He had tried, of course, to solve the problem the only way he knew how, with money. When the first pickup truck slowed, its driver a grizzled farmer with curious eyes, Arthur had waved $100 bill. The man stared at the money, then at Arthur's face, a slow, contemptuous smile spreading across his lips, before he just shook his head and drove on. The rejection left Arthur feeling strangely naked, his primary weapon useless. He didn't know how to change a tire. His hands, so good at signing checks and crushing competitors, were useless against a set of lug nuts. The jack and wrench in the trunk felt like artifacts from another civilization. It was the sheer indignity of it all that got to him. The world he commanded was a world of abstractions, market shares, stock options, strategic alliances. This was the real world, dirty, hot, and profoundly indifferent to the size of his bank account. An unlikely Samaritan. Time stretched and warped in the heat as the sun began its slow descent. He'd given up trying to flag anyone down. He just stood there, a statue of impotent fury, waiting for a tow truck that his assistant, alerted via a panic phone call, assured him was on its way. It would be hours. That's when he saw the figure in the distance, a small silhouette growing steadily larger. It was a young man on a bicycle, pedaling with a slow, weary rhythm. As he drew closer, Arthur could make out the details. He was a young black man, probably no older than 19 or 20, wearing a simple t-shirt, cargo shorts, and a heavy-looking backpack. His face was beaded with sweat, his expression one of quiet determination. Arthur's first instinct was suspicion. He subtly shifted, positioning himself closer to the open car door in a silent, territorial gesture. His mind, conditioned by years of cynical math, started running the angles. What does this kid want? Is he a predator, sensing a target? An opportunist, looking for a handout? The young man slowed his bicycle as he approached the Bentley, his eyes taking in the gleaming, disabled car, the flat tire, and the well-dressed man scowling beside it. He stopped a few feet away, resting one foot on the ground. He didn't speak right away, just observed, his gaze calm and direct. Arthur braced himself for the sob story, the request for cash. Instead, the young man offered a slight nod. "Looks like you've got some trouble there, sir," he said, his voice even. Arthur's response was clipped. "I'm aware." The young man didn't flinch. He gestured with his head toward the flattened tire. "Got a spare?" "In the trunk," Arthur grunted, his tone daring the kid to press further. The young man swung his leg off the bicycle, leaning it against the guardrail. He took a step closer, peering at the wheel. Changing a tire in this heat is no fun. Need a hand? The question hung in the thick air. It was so simple, so direct. It completely disarmed Arthur. There was no angle, no lead up to a request for money. Just an offer. Arthur stared at him, his mind racing to find the catch. There had to be one. Maybe he planned to start working and then demand an insane amount of money. A classic bait and switch. "What's it to you?" Arthur asked, his voice laced with suspicion. The young man shrugged. "Just looks like you could use the help. I'm headed home just down the road. It's no trouble." He looked Arthur in the eye, and for the first time, Arthur saw not an opportunist, but just a person. There was a tiredness in the young man's eyes, but it was overshadowed by a clear, unambiguous sincerity. Against every cynical instinct he had, Arthur heard himself say, "The tools are in the trunk." The young man introduced himself as David as he effortlessly lifted the heavy spare from the trunk. Arthur watched, arms crossed, keeping a careful distance like an observer analyzing every move for a hint of deception. But there was none. David worked with a quiet competence that was almost mesmerizing. His movements were efficient and sure, born of practice. He didn't complain as he crouched on the hot asphalt, expertly loosening the lug nuts that Arthur had imagined were fused to the wheel. Arthur felt a strange, unsettling feeling. In his world, physical labor was something performed by faceless people, outsourced, paid for, and forgotten. To see this young man, David, working so diligently on his behalf, without any contract or promise of payment, was profoundly disorienting. "You seem to know what you're doing," Arthur said, the words feeling clumsy. David glanced up, wiping sweat from his brow. "My dad was a mechanic," he said simply. "Taught me a few things. Said a man ought to know how to handle his own troubles." He gave a small smile. "And how to help someone else with theirs." The words, so plain and simple, hit Arthur like a punch. A man ought to know how to help someone else with theirs. It was a philosophy so alien to his own. In Arthur's world, you hired people to handle troubles. You paid them. It was a transaction, clean and impersonal. This was something else. This was connection. "Why are you really doing this?" Arthur pressed, unable to let go of his skepticism. "What do you want from me?" David stopped and looked up at Arthur, his expression not offended, but genuinely curious, as if Arthur were a puzzle. "Want?" he repeated. "I don't want anything. I saw a man stranded on the side of the road. That could be my father, my brother, or me one day. My mom always says that the kindness you put out into the world has a way of finding its way back to you when you need it most." Arthur was silent. He thought of the cutthroat negotiations, the ruthless downsizing, the enemies he'd made. What kindness had he put out into the world? David's simple philosophy wasn't just different from his own. It was a direct refutation of it. It suggested a world that operated on laws of reciprocity and grace that Arthur had long since dismissed as fairy tales. As David worked, Arthur found himself studying him. He noticed the worn-out soles of his sneakers, the fraying on the straps of his backpack. This was clearly not a person of means, and yet he carried himself with a dignity Arthur rarely saw even in boardrooms. He wasn't acting like he was honored to be helping a man with a car that cost more than he'd likely make in a decade. He was simply a man helping another man. The quality of the act was what was so revolutionary. For the first time in years, Arthur felt a crack appear in his armor. It was a tiny fissure, but light was shining in. He felt a flicker of something he couldn't name. A humbling sensation of being seen not as a source of power or money, but simply as a person in need. He watched as David tightened the last lug nut and lowered the jack. The Bentley stood level again. The entire ordeal, which had felt like an insurmountable crisis, had been solved by the simple, unrewarded labor of a stranger. With the flat tire in the trunk and his hands wiped clean on a rag from David's backpack, the act was complete. But in Arthur's mind, the transaction was just beginning. This was the part he understood. An act of service had been performed, and now it was time for payment. He reached into his jacket, his fingers closing around the familiar thickness of his wallet. He pulled it out and extracted a sheaf of $100 bills, not even counting them. He held them out to David. "Here," he said, his voice regaining its old, commanding tone. "For your trouble." The amount was deliberately, almost insultingly large. It was a power move, a way to turn this strange act of grace back into a simple business deal. A final test. Surely no one, especially not a kid who clearly had so little, could refuse this. David looked at the money, then up at Arthur's face. A slight, sad smile touched his lips. He slowly shook his head. "No, thank you, sir," he said, his voice quiet but firm. Arthur was so taken aback he thought he'd misheard. "What? Don't be ridiculous. Take it. You earned it." "I told you, I didn't do it for money," David replied, shouldering his backpack. "I did it because you needed help. That's all." He met Arthur's astonished gaze. "You have a safe drive home." And with that, he turned, walked to his bicycle, and started to pedal away, disappearing down the sun-drenched road. Arthur stood frozen, the stack of bills still clutched in his hand. The money felt weightless, meaningless. Just paper. He watched David's figure shrink until he was gone. The silence that fell was more profound than the heat, more absolute than his earlier fury. It was the silence of a worldview that had just been shattered. The refusal of the money was a more powerful statement than the help itself. The help had challenged his cynicism. The refusal demolished it. In Arthur's world, everything had a price. But David had just shown him a world where that wasn't true, where kindness could be given freely. Standing there on the side of that forgotten road, with the keys to a multi-million-dollar empire in his pocket, Arthur Pendleton had never felt so spiritually bankrupt. He slowly lowered his hand, the money feeling like a brand of shame. He wasn't just grateful, he was humbled, and that feeling was the beginning of everything that came next. The drive back was a blur. The purr of the Bentley's engine, a sound that usually soothed him, was now just background noise to the roaring silence in his head. The hostile takeover, the victory he'd savored just hours before, now felt like a hollow, pointless game. It all seemed so small compared to the quiet dignity of the young man on the bicycle. David's face was imprinted on his mind, his calm eyes, his simple words. The kindness you put out into the world has a way of finding its way back to you. Arthur's life had been a closed loop. He put out ruthlessness, and he got it back. He'd built a world in his own image, and now, for the first time, he saw how desolate it truly was. He pulled into the long driveway of his estate. The house, usually a symbol of his success, now looked like a mausoleum, vast, silent, and empty. He walked through the grand entryway, his footsteps echoing on the marble floors. The air was cool and sterile. There was no life here, no warmth, just objects, possessions he'd spent a lifetime acquiring, and not a single one could replicate the genuine human connection he'd felt on the side of that hot, dusty road. He walked to the bar and poured a glass of scotch that cost more than David's bicycle. He stared into the amber liquid, but it was David's face he saw. He'd offered the young man money because it was the only language he knew, and David had rejected it. In doing so, he hadn't just refused a payment. He had refused to be devalued. He'd asserted that his kindness existed in a realm beyond commerce, a realm Arthur had forgotten existed. A profound question began to form in Arthur's mind. Who was the rich man in that encounter? Arthur, with his wallet full of cash and his heart full of dust? Or David, with his worn-out sneakers and a spirit so abundant he could give of himself freely? He sat there for hours as the city lights began to twinkle below. He was haunted by a kindness he hadn't earned. And in the depths of that haunting, a new feeling emerged: purpose. He had to find him. This wasn't about rewarding David anymore. A reward felt cheap. This was about something else. He needed to understand that world David lived in, where wealth was measured in character, not currency. He picked up his phone and dialed his chief of security, a man who could find anyone. "I have a job for you," Arthur said, his voice filled with a new resolve. "And it's the most important one I've ever given you." Finding David was harder than Arthur expected. He had a first name, a vague description, and a stretch of rural highway. It wasn't much. Arthur's security team, used to tracking corporate spies, were baffled. They tried facial recognition scans, social media searches, local databases, but David seemed to be a ghost. He had no digital footprint. Days turned into a week. Arthur grew more agitated. The memory of the encounter, instead of fading, grew more vivid. He couldn't focus on work. The stock ticker, the urgent memos, it was all just noise. He even found himself driving back to that same stretch of road, parking and just watching, hoping the young man on the bicycle would reappear. Finally, a breakthrough came from old-fashioned detective work. One of Arthur's investigators, a retired cop, had spent days visiting small businesses and community centers in the area. In a small community church, a woman who ran the youth program recognized the description instantly. "Oh, that sounds like David," she said with a warm smile. David Green, one of the kindest young men you'll ever meet. The report landed on Arthur's desk an hour later. David Green was a sophomore at the local community college, studying architectural design. He lived with his mother, a nursing assistant, and his two younger sisters in a small, rented house. His father, the mechanic, had passed away 2 years prior, leaving the family with a mountain of medical debt. David worked 2 part-time jobs, stocking shelves at a grocery store and bussing tables at a diner. The heavy backpack was filled with his college textbooks. He rode his bike the 10 miles to campus to save on bus fare. His dream was to become an architect who designed affordable, sustainable housing. He wanted to build neighborhoods, not just houses. And he was known throughout his community as the person you could always count on. Arthur read the report 3 times. Each sentence was an indictment of his own life. He had spent his years building a private empire. David was spending his youth trying to build a better community. A deep sense of shame washed over Arthur, followed by an even deeper wave of admiration. He finally understood. Finding David was never about paying him back. It was about paying it forward. The following Saturday, Arthur drove himself to David's neighborhood in a nondescript sedan, not the Bentley. He parked at the end of the street and walked toward the small, tidy house. Through the window, he could see the soft glow of a lamp and hear the faint sound of laughter. He stood on the sidewalk for a long moment. He, Arthur Pendleton, who could make titans of industry tremble, was afraid to knock on this door. What right did he have to impose himself on this family? He took a deep breath and walked up the path. Before his knuckle could touch the wood, the door swung open. It was David. He was holding a bag of trash, and he froze, his eyes widening in disbelief. "You," David whispered, stunned. "Hello, David," Arthur said, his voice softer than he'd intended. A woman, David's mother, appeared behind him. "David, who is it?" "It's all right, Mom," David said, recovering. "This is the gentleman I helped with a flat tire." Arthur extended a hand to David's mother. "Arthur Pendleton, ma'am." It's an honor. He then looked back at David. I hope this isn't an intrusion. I needed to speak with you. They invited him in. The house was small and filled with the comfortable clutter of a real family. Framed photos, kids' artwork on the fridge, the smell of cookies. It felt more like a home than his sterile mansion ever had. They sat in the small living room, and Arthur began to explain. He didn't talk about his wealth. He spoke of his cynicism, his loneliness, and the profound impact of David's selfless act. You did more than change my tire that day, Arthur said, his voice thick with emotion. You reminded me of a part of myself I thought was long dead. You showed me what true wealth is, and it has nothing to do with what's in my bank account. It's character. It's heart. David and his mother listened, their expressions shifting from surprise to understanding. I didn't come here to give you a reward, Arthur continued, looking directly at David. That would insult what you did. I came here to make an investment. He slid a thick envelope across the coffee table. My investigators, they told me about your dream. This envelope contains a full scholarship to the best architectural university in the country. It covers everything. Tuition, housing, books. David stared at the envelope, speechless. Tears welled in his mother's eyes. But that's not all, Arthur said, leaning forward. An investment needs a return. I'm starting a new foundation, dedicated to developing affordable housing. It needs a heart. When you graduate, I want you to come work with me. Not for me, with me. I want you to help guide its mission. He looked at the stunned young man who had changed his life. You helped me when I was stranded. Now I want to help you build the world you dream of. Tears streamed down David's face. He looked at his mother, who was now openly weeping, and then back at the man on his doorstep. In the end, it was never about the car or the money. It was about two worlds colliding on a lonely stretch of road, one of gilded isolation, the other of quiet, resilient community. The simple act of changing a tire became a profound exchange. Arthur, the millionaire, had his entire worldview dismantled and rebuilt, and David, the young man with nothing but a good heart and a heavy backpack, was given the tools to make his dreams a reality. Arthur learned that the greatest transactions in life have nothing to do with money, and that the most valuable asset you can ever have is faith in the goodness of others. A faith he had lost, and that a young man on a bicycle, expecting nothing, gave back to him. If this story reminded you of the power of a single act of kindness, please share it with one who might need to see it. For more stories that restore your faith in humanity, don't forget to subscribe. You never know when one story might just change your day.